was closely related to some of the issues that Enotie Egbobor will be talking about when he makes his presentation. And I think the other thing I just want to say, to just sort of place it in the context of Cambridge, is that it's quite a fitting place, I think, to be having this discussion because a lot of these issues have been raised directly here. Of course, as all of you know, there's been a lot of debate and activism around decolonizing the curriculum with students here, and also through the labours and efforts of Dr. Priya Gopal and others, mainly driven actually by the Department of Literature here. And the other incidents and discussions that you will remember taking place here are around the Okpa, the cockerel, which was looted in 1897 as part of the Benin punitive raid by the British, and was for many, many years in the dining room of Jesus College. So that's another thing which gives us cause to be here, and in relation to what we're going to be hearing today. And the other more positive benefit, of course, and event are the series of discussions. One of the last Benin Dialogue groups, of course, was held here at Cambridge last year, and I was very glad to be part of that, and I know a lot of you were there as well, and very many positive and constructive things arose out of that series of discussions. So that's something which feeds into the panel today as well. I thought it might be useful, just very quickly, I was just looking up definitions of restitution. This is the kind of thing my students do, actually, when they're trying to take up time from something else. But it was sort of rather poignant, so I just wanted to read you a couple of definitions, just to give us also a different kind of sort of setting of framework and language, which might be helpful in framing the discussion. So the first one I came across was the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and it has quite an elaborate definition. The first one being a restoration of something to its rightful owner, a making good or giving an equivalent for some injury. And the second part of that is the equitable remedy of restoring to an aggrieved party that which was obtained in unjust enrichment. The Cambridge Dictionary is rather bolder, and they have two definitions here: the return of objects that were stolen or lost, and secondly, payment made for damage or loss. And the Wiki definition is much more closely related to definitions in law. So the law of restitution is the law of gains-based recovery, and it's to be contrasted with the law of compensation, which is the law of loss-based recovery. So when a court orders restitution, it orders the defendant to give up his or her gains to the claimant. So let me introduce now, in the order in which they'll speak, our speakers for the panel, all of which are going to be talking about very specific instances that they have had close experience of, where issues of return of cultural property have been central to the kind of work and research they've been doing. So Ulrich Mentor, before taking up his present position as Senior Curator Oceania at the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, held the position of head of the ethnographic collections of the Römer and Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim in Germany. And his main interests are the material culture of the Pacific Islands, as well as general museum ethnology. Enotie Egbobor is an artist who works in mixed media and various medias, in oil, acrylics, textile, sculpture, music and video. And he's been a professional for 23 years and is considered an expert on Benin court art. He also has a particular focus on society and environmental issues, but he's also part of the Benin royal family through marriage and is helping to lead development of a new palace museum in Benin City. So that's going to be part of what we'll be hearing from Enotie. And Nicholas Thomas, who you all know, who's one of the hosts of this gathering here, has a special interest in colonial encounters in the Pacific and has been director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology here since 2006. So with that, I will give the floor over to Ulrich.
Thank you.
And people will be speaking for roughly 15 minutes. So wait, is that yours?
This one.
No, yeah.
No, remove restricted.
No, do that.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, which I enjoyed very much for the last 2 days. And also before I start, I have to admit that I was taken a bit by surprise when I found myself on the list of speakers in this panel. So I must apologize for this presentation being made on a very short notice, and also the PowerPoint may sometimes look a bit And I didn't have the time to have a professional English speaker read over my notes, so please bear with me. I hope that I will be able to contribute something to the discussion that has been going on since yesterday, because yesterday a lot of topics of restitution and repatriation were already mentioned. I also would like to put in front of what I have to say that the questions of restitution and repatriation touch very sensitive areas of museum politics, besides being very, very sensitive areas in itself. And the Linden Museum does not have a general policy for repatriation or restitution. And it's more further complicated by the fact that the ownership of everything in the Linden Museum is shared by equal parts by the state of Baden-Württemberg and the city of Stuttgart. So standing here, I cannot speak on behalf of the museum, but only as in my position as curator of the Oceania collection and my opinion on certain questions. Well, Annie has already mentioned in the introduction, since 2015, I'm curator of the Oceania collections at Linden Museum. This museum was founded in 1911, and its antecedents, the institutions before, go back to 1882. So the history of this museum is firmly grounded in the high time of German colonialism, and the vast majority of collections actually derive from this time. And the thing is that beyond this very general time frame, we often know very little about the collections, because there has not been done much research, except for some singled out collection where we know a lot. This is further complicated by the fact that the sources are widely spread in the museum, but also in different institutions like the state archives, and they have not been researched for a long, in an intensive way. This has changed in the last 2 years when the Linden Museum was part of a project called Schwieriges Erbe, which had the official English translation of discomforting heritage. I rather would have opted for difficult heritage, but that's the way it is. And on the side of Linde Museum, we carried out intensive provenance research, which was done by Gesa Grimme, a researcher that was with the museum until this year. Her results, the final results of the research will be published shortly in this year's yearbook of the museum, the Tribus. So I will give a short look into her work that she did, that she described herself as dense documentation. So she tried to find as many sources and gather them together on the various collections. The University of Tübingen, as the second partner in this project, had a different focus. They actually looked into the reasons that might lie behind the enormous upsurge that the discussion of colonial heritage and with it the demands of giving it back by the German public have the reasons behind the enormous that was the sentence, yeah. Again, we hope that the results for this research from the university will be coming out during this year. It's just that was some premises, some first thoughts they had on what may lie behind this, because it's not very noticeable in Germany that the topic of colonialism for a long time was no topic, a non-topic, and then all of a sudden it just was very strongly written about in the media and in the general public discussion. Well, now to the provenance research that Gesa had done in the museum. The research focused on 3 regional collections. That was mainly for practical reasons, because these these collections would figure very importantly in upcoming exhibitions, or because in the case of Oceania, it was difficult to just single out a single exhibition. So it was collections from Namibia, from Cameroon, and the Bismarck Archipelago, which comprise about 25 objects all in all, and were acquired by about 315 various people who have different affiliations with the German colonial project during the turn of the century. This research not only gave us more information about the people, but also brought up some of the problematic and also the unlawful aspects of object acquisitions that for some cases we didn't know about and that were not in the open. The visible results of this, or the most visible result of this research is, I would say, an experimental database that that Gesa created and put together, that enables us, or in the future it will enable us to easily access information connected with the acquisition of collections and objects, and connect them with biographical data and the various archival sources. So what you see here is like a starting, then from this you can go on and delve deeper into the various collections and their composition of how they are put together, when they came, how they were maybe acquired in different places. Something missing? That's the same, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's funny. Well, that arrow should have been earlier. I don't understand what's going on here, but here it's only 1, 2 slides, so try it. Oh, no, oh no, this is like the dense personal biographical information that we may have of a person like here, Oberleutnant Jesko von Puttkammer, and it also says when he was at various places in the areas, and which is usually quite difficult to find if you come work with a collection. And so here we have it all in one. Come on, this is not. They don't want me to leave this. So you see that there's various stages, and you get the question that remains, though, even if we have this documentation, what we do with the information, and how we could and should act on this. And I remember there was, when I talked about the first stages of this project at the workshop here in Cambridge, there was some very heated discussion about what the museum then should do with this. My personal opinion, we don't have a decision on this yet, but my personal opinion on this is that, and it has been mentioned here already, that it is not our decision to look at this and then decide, well, we give this back. We need the demands and requests by communities and the descendants of the original owners to react on this and give their decisions and their questions to our collections, and what are ways to display it, and what are ways to dispose of them if necessary. And in this case, it's our responsibility to make the information that we gather, whatever the consequences may be, public, to make it accessible, and to make it accessible in ways that people outside of the museum can actually work with it. Because it's like this, I mean, we can put it online and we won't get a reaction. Nobody will know what to do with it. But I also have to admit at this point that with a very, very tiny proportion, I don't even know if it's 1%, of our collection online, the Linde Museum has a very, very long way to go on this. Now I try the next one. Okay. One possibility to move further on this way is the grant that the Linde Museum got from the Kulturstiftung des Bundes, the Federal Foundation for Culture and the Arts, that gave money to museums. Barbara Plankensteiner mentioned it, to the museums in Hamburg, Leipzig, and Stuttgart, to move forward in the way of presentation, to find new ways of also acting on those collections. And the Linde Museum will go on with deep provenance research, but also look into restructuring of exhibitions and find new ways of working with communities and enhance participation with communities in the world and Stuttgart itself. One last thing, it's fitting with a strong interest in the colonial in Germany at the moment that the Museumsbund, the German Museum Federation, has published its guidelines to working with objects from a colonial context this year. And it has been already strongly criticized for some part, or the general slant of this publication, because they have a very strong emphasis on the legal aspects of restitution and repatriation. And to put it very, very lightly, the grounds for repatriation and restitution often derives from ethical and moral responsibilities that we have, and not from a legalistic background. And here I would like to come back to what Claudia Augustat said on the first day of the conference, when she asserted that decisions of having it back, I would say, have to be made by the members of so-called source communities and the descendants of the original owners. And the museum on its side has to be willing to give it back. And I would like to add here, it also has to be able to do this. And at the moment in Germany, or the situation as I see it in Stuttgart, is very difficult, because you're at the start, if you get into negotiations, you get into talks, you never know how politics will decide in the end, because the museum does not decide. It does give recommendations and so on, and an open discussion on this won't be possible. Now just shortly, two two actual instances in the Linden Museum. I, in my case, have not been involved with active cases of repatriation. We are now working with the Australian Embassy, because there's ancestral remains are going to be repatriated to Australia in the near future. And then there's also a case of communities from central Australia near Hermannsburg, Arnhem Land, who came to the museum to look at objects from their history, I'd say, who they, in some instances, would like to have back in Australia. And this is just an excerpt from our inventory. Those objects belong to the vast group of objects that we would classify as sacred secret. We will not put them on display. Some of them are highly fragile, and we've had very fruitful discussions in the museum of ways to either give back or to work on the ways we store them, how we handle them, and to find out ways that would suit both sides in the further now this is legal terms. Ownership, does ownership imply the legal ownership or just the having of objects? In German, I would say Besitz, so not the Eigentum, but the Besitz, and so it's we are working on this. This is further complicated by the fact that, and this is a letter from Oskar Liebler, the collector from Hermannsburg, to Augustin Krämer, then director of the Linden Museum, that it's not clear how these collections were done, because Linden or Krämer from the museum, he more or less ordered what he wanted, and it was produced to his order. And the letters imply, and we have proof of one sending at least, that actually hair from Stuttgart was sent to Australia to make these hair ornaments, because there was not enough, the Aborigines themselves did not have not enough hair to produce. So these are all questions that have to be talked and that may be of relevance to the actual case. And to close up, just a look at a very recent event that we had in the Linden Museum, thanks to Switch. It was we had an exhibition on Hawaii until 13th of May, and during the last week of the exhibition, we could have a project week we called Including Voices from Afar, connecting it to the workshop that we had in Stuttgart. And in this week, we invited the Hawaiian artist Maile Andrade, who you may know, also professor at the Kamakakuo Kalani Center for Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii, Marquez Marzan, who's also a well-known fiber artist. Oh, here they are. Well-known fiber artist from Honolulu, and Kaliko Spencer, a kappa artist, who's just I'd say, on the rise. And we had a series of workshops as well in the museum, internally with our staff, as externally with people coming from, yeah, I'm done. And it was quite interesting. On the one hand, with our staff, how complicated we see some things, or our conservators, and how difficult we make things, and how easily the Hawaiians acted on some questions, like how to handle certain objects, how, what may we do, what may we do with these things, what may we show the public. And on the side of the public, I was astonished how strong the question of repatriation, of giving things back, came from our visitors. The Hawaiians didn't talk about this. They didn't, it was not a topic they were in this event interested in, but the visitors always ask, well, how come this is here? Doesn't it have to go back? You may not have it. And I would like to close with a remark that those of you who were in Stuttgart, at the workshop in Stuttgart, have heard when Noel Kahanu, also a well-known Hawaiian legal, she's a lawyer with a very strong in repatriation, and she said that these objects are ambassadors. They were gifted to forge relations. They've been here for a long time, and they may go back to create new relations. And maybe that's a closing remark. Sometimes we have to be more relaxed in all of this and listen more to what the others tell us about these questions and the collections that we work with and that we take care of. Thank you very much.
I'm going to go down the front, actually, because I realized I missed the slides presentation. Yeah, so I'll come back up.
Ayomakua muge nibie. Yo nyama samao. Rama wenu re me. Ayomakua muge nibie. Yo yame yo obano gedo. Yo obano gedo. Thank you. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm an artist. I've now worked in a museum. I've always visited museums as an outsider, as a visitor. And so the past couple of days, I've learned a lot. A sneak peek at the workings of museums and what goes into, all the great work you do all over the world. I also got to know the strong difference between museums, normal museums, and ethnographic museums. And I think it has been very, very well received. So today I'm here to talk as an ambassador of sorts for the Benin Kingdom and the case for the repatriation of the bronze, ivory, and wood, and whatever other artifacts that were looted from Benin in 1897. Because Benin Kingdom is recorded to have flourished for centuries. And the surest evidence of this are the artifacts of bronze, brass, ivory, wood, and textile that exist to tell the stories in various museums all over the world. The Benin Kingdom still exists, albeit within Edo State, which is part of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and which is governed by a democratic constitution. You can see the photograph of Professor Thomas and Professor Annie Coombs and their son Nicholas visiting the Oba of Benin earlier on this year. So you see that the kingdom and the king is still flourishing. We are here. And so we would like to be part and parcel of our narrative, of saying and speaking this narrative to the world. And most of the artifacts in various museums and private collections all over the world were looted from the palaces in Benin in 1897, and today bear witness to the civilization that existed then. Today, the lineage of the monarchy, of which succession is by primogeniture, which is the first son becomes the king, saw the ascension of to the Benin throne of the present king, Omonobanedo, Oba Egwaye II, as the 40th Oba of Benin. The 40th Oba. And before him, the kingdom was known as Igodomigodo. And as Igodomigodo, the kings were known as Ogiso. And there were 31 Ogisos. So if you do the maths, some say the kingdom has existed for over 2,000 years. Some say for over 6,000 years. Some say for 1,500 years. You are the experts. We hope that as we continue to look at these objects, we can arrive at an approximate time frame for the existence of this kingdom and this civilization. Now, out of the various guilds which produce these masterpieces in ivory, bronze, brass, wood, leather, only the Guild of Bronze and Brass Casters are still quartered in their historic district, and a dwindling number continue to practice this craft. But there's a complete disconnect and a missing link between the modern-day Benin people, or Edo people, and the works of their ancestors. These works were created primarily for various reasons. Many of the works of ivory and brass and bronze works were created to adorn religious altars in the various palace shrines, which were numerous, and others were used during religious ceremonies, because in the past, only the Oba could use bronze or brass items on the shrines. The chiefs and all other prominent noblemen could only use wood. So there are also numerous plaques that were created to record the history of the kingdom and the exploit of the kings. A lot of these items were created, a lot of other items were created for utility purposes. For example, to serve kola nuts, to serve drinks, or to keep herbs. So, the British invasion and the forceful removal of these works truncated the centuries-old curriculum of the artists and craftsmen who produced these works. Because previously, you belong to a guild, and you have to progress, in the guild as you advance in your skill. And so you are taken from one part of the palace to the other, so you see highly skilled works, better works. So the more you see these works, the more you yourself are inspired, and then you are taught until you get to the stage where you are proficient enough to produce items that can be presented to the king. And for this, you were rewarded. All you had to do was focus on producing these items, on honing your skills and talents. You were provided with food, you were provided with housing, and all the other things you need to keep your family or yourself going. And so, today, because of this disconnect, today we see only poor replicas of these works, and the excellent masterpieces produced by their forebears are in distant museums and private collections hidden away from their view. This can be likened to taking the works of Homer, Plato, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Renoir, Van Gogh, Picasso, Whistler, Shakespeare, and keeping them away. If you do this, from the British, European, and American citizens, artists, and craftsmen, you never would have had the museums, galleries, auction houses, tourism, and civilization that you have today. These Benin artifacts need to be brought back to Benin so that they can contribute to enlightening the indigenous people and inspire them to dig deep and strive to surpass the arduous, meticulous attention to detail of their ancestors, which produced masterpieces. Hopefully, they can be inspired to apply this in all facets of their modern-day life and build a new society based on excellence. The economic benefits from tourism and the multiplier effects of this cannot be ignored. We need a slice of the multi-billion-dollar industry. The enlightenment and economic benefits will also create employment and stop cases of illegal immigrants, which involves human trafficking, the sex trade, organ trade, and drug trafficking, which is a scourge that has hit Edo State very badly. You should know that the majority of those who are crossing through Libya to get to Europe by crossing the dangerous Mediterranean Sea using canoes and inadequate crafts are from Edo State. And so we also believe that with this, we can achieve a lot if we have these objects that can form a basis for a tourism industry. But we also realize that to achieve this lofty objective, we need to be strategic, realistic, and focused. We are mindful and thankful for the efforts initiated and sustained by various directors of museums in Europe and in the United Kingdom to repatriate these works or to keep the discussion going. The Benin Discussion Group has been very helpful. Professor Annie Combs and Professor Thomas have also been very helpful. Professor Barbara Plankensteiner has done a lot to bring these issues to the front burner, and so we are grateful for all their efforts. So these laudable efforts have generated interest amongst governments, and we are focused now on building a world-class museum in Benin City to house these works when they are returned in a safe environment where they can be displayed for the local community and for the global public view and research. We hope that with this collaboration and with these kinds of interaction, we'll be able to achieve this within a very short framework. The governor of my state, Mr. Godwin Obaseki, and the Oba of Benin, Oba Ewari II, are very focused on developing this Royal Benin Museum as a strategic intervention, if you say, to ensure that when these works come back, they have a safe place to stay, and also, in the future, we can also have exchanges. I mean, why can't we have a Picasso retrospective in Benin? This is possible, you know? And this brings us more tightly knit into the global environment. So you can see the masterpieces which were produced and which are in various museums. I'm sure some of you can identify them. They might even be in your museum. And so, but we are not resting on our hours. We're also making efforts to ensure that this is my studio, and I also do some form of culture tours, so we can take people to the bronze casters where they can see the process of the casting. I also have this big space which, in collaboration with the government, I've established to enable young creatives have a platform to come and express themselves, to hone their skill, and learn how to interact with their audience and the public. And so we want to seek partners to achieve this laudable objective, and we hope that you will all be willing to join us in achieving this objective. I'm very happy to have heard in the last couple of days the tone and the enthusiasm which I know supports repatriation. I know you are hampered by legislation, policy of your various governments, but you know what they say, little drops of water make an ocean. I would like to leave you with this philosophical thought from ancient Greece in their classification of human beings. The Greeks believed that humanity was divided broadly into 3 groups. And the first group, they called the idiot. Not the idiot because they were mentally retarded or stupid, but the idiot because all the idiot thinks about is himself, his personal selfish interest. They also have the second group, which is known as his tribesman. We all belong to tribes, yes, but the tribesman only thinks about the interest of his tribe. He is willing to destroy others only for the selfish interest of his tribe. And then the third group is the citizen. The citizen thinks about the good of everybody. And so today, I'm hoping that you will join us so that we can see you as global citizens in our quest to build this museum and to ensure that our heritage, which was looted in 1897, can come back home to a befitting place where we can all benefit from these items. Thank you very much.
Because otherwise it's hard to see, and then we can all go back.
I wanted to make a couple of general comments and then talk a little bit about a case study and then just say a couple of more personal things at the very end. There's been an awful lot of discussion of the Macron speech. People don't seem to have talked very much about what he actually said. I think the full text of it is very interesting. I was struck by the insistence upon the need for partnerships and also by the fact that he went out of his way to implicate African agents, recalling George's discussion yesterday, in the trafficking of works. He insists on this being a more complex history. And the speech, incidentally, was supposed to have been taken a lot of preparation on the part of his staff. So I don't think those were accidental, off-the-cuff observations. And he also talked about the importance of capacity building, and he also signalled at the end that the works were part of our heritage too. And I'm not sure whether he meant by that they were part of a I assume what he meant was that they were part of the heritage of humanity. In the British context, if some of us said that, or if I said that, I think I would be talking about their connections with a shared colonial history. But I thought it was just worth drawing attention to those strands of his discourse, which I think implied that the work he projected will be demanding and time-consuming and will have many dimensions to it and possibly quite diverse outcomes. The second general point I wanted to make is that I think my own perspective is slightly different to what I would see as having become the dominant discourse in Germany about colonial Raubkunst, about loot. The assumption is that if the provenances of things are illegitimate, tainted in that sense, they should be returned. There's another kind of argument which I would say is more broadly about public benefit that has somewhat different implications. So let me talk briefly about an issue that's played out over the last couple of years. Following an exhibition at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, which was primarily of objects from the British Museum, returned for exhibition in Australia for the first time. It included a few other pieces, including spears from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. That Canberra exhibition triggered a campaign by Rodney Kelly, who is a man of Gwagal descent. Gwagal are the people, the indigenous people of the Botany Bay area in Sydney's south, who were the people who came into contact with Cook first on the 28th of April 1770. Rodney Kelly is a direct descendant of a man named Cooman, and his understanding reported in this news item is that it was his ancestor who confronted Cook and whose spears and shield were appropriated. This is in the British Museum. The spears are here in the collection here. And this campaign gathered some support, particularly from the politicians in the Green Party, who put this motion through the what's called the Legislative Council, which is the upper house of the state parliament in New South Wales, and also through the Australian Senate. So this was passed. That doesn't mean it's government policy. Those bodies can pass whatever motions they like. And they represented the same understanding of that history that's reported in the newspaper, as a matter of fact that Cooman was the man who was confronted and shot at, and his artifacts were taken by Cook. And the last part of it affirms the importance of Rodney Kelly's campaign and supports that campaign and directs the Australian government to extend diplomatic assistance to him. This, in some ways, is quite extraordinary because Rodney was making this campaign as an individual, and the Guayagal people are, in the Australian context, legally represented by a body called the La Perouse Local Area Land Council. When the Green Party decided to support this campaign, they did not contact or consult with or talk to the La Perouse Local Area Land Council. So those of us who've had dealings with Indigenous issues in a variety of countries, in a variety of contexts, might be rather surprised that national politicians in Australia would not do what you would have thought would be the first thing that they would do, which is consult with the bodies that are recognised as being representative of those people. Following the campaign getting underway, Gay Sculthorpe, who's a head of the Oceania section at the British Museum and a very experienced curator who's also worked for the Native Title Tribunal in Australia. She is of Indigenous Tasmanian descent herself. And I got liaised not only with Rodney, who has visited this museum and the British Museum and others, including Stockholm, a number of times, got into an extended process of dialogue with people. Shane Williams is a Guayagal elder. Nolene was not at the time, but is now the chair of that land council. And Maria Nugent is a historian who has worked closely with them. There have been many visits and meetings in Sydney and Cambridge and London over the past couple of years to explore this process. And there have been a range of complications that it has thrown up. The shield is actually essentially an unprovenanced artefact in the sense of the specific documentation in the British Museum context. It was identified about 50 years ago by Australian researchers as the one appropriated by Cook on that occasion, and that identification was, if you like, canonised through Neil McGregor's well-known radio series and book, The History of the World in 100 Objects. That, sorry, I've got my slides out of order, but you know this book anyway. That identification rests entirely on one piece of evidence, which is the drawing on the left by a draftsman of German descent, a natural history illustrator called Miller, who illustrated all the objects that, a sample of the objects that Banks had in his house immediately after the voyage. So the ship came back in, was it August 1771? And in the latter part of that year, Miller drew a whole range of the objects that were in Banks's house, and those drawings are fetishistically precise. So there are woven objects, and there's a funny little knot, and there's a hole in the knot, and Miller has drawn the hole in the knot in the weaving. And what researchers observed was that the hole in the shield was in the same place, so it must be the same object. But what they didn't actually do was take the trouble to compare the shield oriented in the same way as it is in Miller's rather singular drawing. And I'm not going to go into a sort of lengthy argument about this, but I think it's now become clear that it's not the same shield. The assumption was made partly because the hole was supposed to be in the same place, but what was being overlooked was that shields actually nearly always have spear holes clustered in the middle, because that's what they were for. If you'd done something wrong, you were part of a sort of a formal dispute settlement, an enactment of law, and you had to hold a shield and people would throw spears at you, and so you kind of manipulate the shield so that you're protected, and the holes tend to cluster near the centre. And there are plenty of other shields like this one in Manchester, which also have holes near the middle. The hole in the shield in the BM is coincidentally in a similar place, but in fact not the same place as the one in the drawing. People tend to make the assumption that you know, it's a British Navy voyage, so the natural destination of artefacts is in the British Museum. In fact, the artefacts end up in many places and have complex trajectories of all sorts. And in fact, I have a pretty good idea of where the shield, the real shield, was in 1837, but unfortunately I don't know where it's been since. Of course, we know that the spears were collected on the 28th of April, and so Rodney's campaign came to focus on them, and the Green senator who was supporting his campaign prepared a submission, and a formal claim was received in Cambridge about a year and a half ago, slightly longer. As it happened, the chair of the MAA's museum committee at the time was a very eminent lawyer. I'm not sort of producing his whole CV, but he did work in the former Yugoslavia and so has quite a lot of legal experience in relation to very difficult issues. And he came up with an opinion that I think was quite important to our proceedings, which was this. But the subcommittee that was set up considered the submission very, very carefully and solicited information from Guagel and other people about their views with respect to the claim. And before I come on to that, I just want to say very briefly that I think one of the other complicating cases with respect to these artifacts is that the spears are part of a larger collection of slightly over 100 objects that Cook personally presented to his Admiralty patron immediately after the arrival of the ship. His Admiralty patron was the Lord Sandwich, and he presented the artifacts to Trinity College within 3 months of the return of the Endeavour, and they arrived at Trinity College with this list of about 102 pieces. That group of just over 100 artifacts was then transferred to MAA, although it's still legally, whatever that means, owned by the college. That collection is the largest collection, the largest single collection that is documented from Cook's first voyage. It's also, so far as I can understand, more or less the very first systematically made, documented collection of extra-European material culture that was field collected and made in this kind of way and deposited by any European from anywhere. So this, as an assemblage, has very specific significance. It's a historic formation in itself, and I must acknowledge that my own view is that it would be damaging in various senses to permanently separate elements of this collection from the assemblage. That's not to say that the geographic distribution of artifacts is not a different issue and an open issue. The subcommittee engaged in these consultations, and you don't have to read all of this, but this is part of the submission from the Gayagal elder, Shane Williams. He said inter alia what historians are very, very clear about, which is that we have no idea which individuals Cook encountered at that time in Botany Bay. There are a whole range of reasons why the particular people cannot be identified. The Cooman story comes from a sort of local historian, a non-academic historian who, a white historian who generated work that was of interest to Rodney. Yeah. So he also said his submission also expressed concerns about the whole repatriation framework, and in a sense, the third sentence from the bottom is the most critical part of that. Shane's concern is that if things come back, they have the potential to generate a lot of division among a community that is somewhat fragmented. And here he signals that what matters above all to him is sustained research and sustained collaboration. So essentially, because Rodney was not in any sense a representative of the group, the claim was rejected, but there have been continuing discussions about the Spears going back to the Australian Museum in Sydney on longer term loan. And Rodney, in fact, is becoming very supportive of that set of possibilities, even though his social media messaging is tends to be in a sort of more confrontational sort of register. What I wanted to say at the end was just that I think there are two things I really don't want to happen. Many of us have been in these kinds of meetings, around tables, talking about the future of artefacts. I think there's a sense of momentum at the moment, and the first thing I really don't want to happen is that our successors and Anote's children or their children are having the same discussions in 20 years' time. The second thing I really don't want to happen is for things to happen too quickly and to be done badly, so that artefacts go back in ways that are not of public benefit to the wider community, us as citizens, as you put it. Thank you.
Great, Ulrich. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. And thanks to all our speakers. Let me just check, what time do we have left? Because we started a little late, and I just want to make sure we don't run into other people's time. What's the deal here? So we can have some discussion.
Over page.
Yeah. 11.
Well, we could have 10 minutes, I think.
Okay, good. I mean, I, just as a chair, just wanted to say a couple of things and then open it up. I mean, obviously, discussions took place yesterday, so I don't want to take up too much time. But there were certain things that came up for me as I was listening to all the papers, and I just wanted to say a few things about that. We heard from Ulrich, and also we've heard from the Oba as well, and Anote, in other contexts, that objects can also act as ambassadors. So that was one of the things that has come through from the source communities, so-called, the owners of those objects, cultural owners of those objects. That is also how these objects have seen. So movement and travel of these cultural objects is very important for them as well. Ulrich's issue about returns and details of how works may be disposed of or how they may be displayed, and the issue of those details coming from the communities and ancestors of the communities that originally owned those objects and used those objects was another thing that came up. And also the importance in Enotier's talk of the unforeseen impact for future generations of the removal of work. We would expect, I think, Enotier to say, and understood him when, you were saying, Enotier, about the importance of how that kind of interruption in 1897 of the work of the guilds and a whole line of artisans, the removal of work equivalent to, if Homer or Shakespeare had been taken from Western Europe, for example, what would the impact be? But the unforeseen impact is the sort of lowering of self-esteem and the complications which have resulted in human trafficking. So that's a more complicated kind of set of impacts, which I think are not normally sort of thought through or taken into account of. And the third thing I just wanted to say about what Nick was talking about with that really interesting forensic work on the Guergel shield and the spears is the importance of the detail of historical research and the provenance work that Ulrich also in his museum and others you here are doing. The complicated detail of that historical work and the time that takes, but also the way in which we would need to take account of the self-identification of those making claims, like Rodney, with the objects they are asking for and the objects they want back. So what do we do with the tension between those two things? Just one quick thing I wanted to say. I've just come back from Australia where we've been working on massacre sites and memorialization of those sites with Aboriginal Indigenous people there. And one of the things that was objects that people have been talked about to do with research on these histories, which for many years have been denied, are, on the one hand, historians very carefully categorized map of massacre sites in Australia, Lyndall Ryan, but on the other hand, another kind of map which was produced of massacre sites, which allowed for a different kind of and a different category of evidence through gossip, through serendipity, through hearsay, produced by Judy Watson, an Indigenous Australian artist. So I just wanted to raise the issue of what we do with different kinds of evidence and different notions of where belonging can be placed in relation to the kinds of evidence that other people may want to use in their claims for objects. And there's a tension between those two things, which I find interesting. So I could ask that as a question, but I also know that people here will have things that they want to raise. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor. Yes.
I have two questions, one for Andy and the other one for the first one is, if you would like to think, it's how could the idea of copy or of replica could be used in this repatriation discourse, if you ever thought of that? That's the first question. And the second question, I need to give a bit of background. It's a Romanian philosopher of culture called Lucian Blaga, who wrote in the beginning of the 20th century a book called Civilizations in Europe. And he talks about two different civilizations. Civilizations of stone, he calls them, and civilizations of wood. Even if we talk about Europe, he says, what kind of materials people use when they build their own homes, traditional kind of homes, impacts very much on how they understand culture and how they preserve things generally. In a civilization of stone, people are much more obsessed with this kind of stability. Whereas in civilizations of stone in Europe, like Eastern Europe, for example, where people would build huts, and even they do it in the present, this idea of, not permanent kind of things and not keeping things. It's part of how the society works. And I want to bring this idea further and ask you, don't you think that imposing on other people around the world ideas of how objects should be kept in proper museums, in a way in civilizations of stone kind of paradigm, it's a bit problematic?
Well, you want to-
Did you want
Who
to
would
comment
like
on the
to
first
respond?
one about
Energy?
replicas?
Oh, well, you see, a replica is not the original. And when you put it in context, if you tell somebody this was done 500 years ago, 600 years ago, it has a different meaning, it has a different awe to it than when you get them to say, this is a replica of this. And if you think about it, today, you're not allowed to kill elephants for ivory. But some of our most precious artifacts are made from ivory. And they were done in a particular way. They were done with a particular method, with particular instruments, which today you don't have. So if you're going to take some laser cutting equipment to cut a replica and all of that, it's not the same thing. The inlaying process and all of that. So if you come to Benin and you see the way the bronzes are being cast, the lost wax method, Cire-Perdue method, when you see the way it's done, you begin to realize that every bronze work is an original because there's no cast, there's no mold. Everyone is an original. And you see the way they do it, the way they go about it. They invest some of their spirit, some of their volition into these works. So the work is different. But if you talk about replicas, who's going to do the replicas? Because the craftsmen of today do not have the skills of the craftsmen of times past. And if you take a different way to make these replicas, then you cannot really call them replicas because it's quite not the same way. So I think also the tie-in to the fact that this was produced by your ancestor has a different meaning for the human being than.
I think there's a short answer, which is that many, many indigenous people are very invested in things being preserved. I mean, of course, one can have a wider sort of philosophical discussion about whether we should want things preserved or whether it's an imposition on people to say that they should be. But I think, you know, many of us have had people attach extraordinary importance to things because they have been preserved, and I think we have a commitment to those people and people in the future to respect those wishes, those interests, even if, you know, there may be some other people who say, you know, I don't want something preserved. I don't think they can outvote everyone who might come after them.
Paul.
Thanks very much. Really interesting set of questions posed by those three papers. I just wanted to go back to that issue about the circumstances in which objects were acquired and this notion of legitimacy or illegitimacy. And so Nick's put that slide up very interestingly about that. I mean, is the issue of legitimacy or around acquisition a red herring, or how does it matter? So, in some senses, there were kind of three perspectives there that I was trying to unpick, all which seemed to be suggesting that you know, anything that was collected in a colonial context broadly is somehow illegitimate. So therefore, it's that we have no, even if it was purchased or commissioned, the museum doesn't necessarily, you know, because of the power inequalities of the time, etc. It's not up to us to decide on the fate of that. Enotti's example, of course, is a classic illegitimate kind of instance where, you know, this is a punitive expedition context, forcibly taking things. But again, what if, 10 years later, similar types of objects were purchased in the market, for instance, or commissioned of those same craftspeople and so on. And then just to untangle that pairing, of saying that not all illegitimately acquired objects should be returned, and some legitimately acquired objects should be returned. So I'm just trying to figure out, is the issue of the legitimacy in that broader colonial context, does it matter, or is that just a red herring in this debate?
All right, maybe.
May I just ask what a red herring is?
Sorry for that Britishism. I'm not quite sure how to explain it. It's a false premise, if you like.
Oh, okay.
Sort of sending you off on the wrong track.
As opposed to a green herring or something, I don't know.
Yeah, I hope I'm not misunderstood there. I'm not saying, I didn't want to say that everything that came into the museum in the time of German colonialism is per se illegitimate and has to be given back. But with doing this research, the provenance research, and this is, of course, a different provenance research than what Nick was talking about, which is very concentrated on a certain collection and object. This was more about a more general approach, but it should make us aware of the context and the probable illegitimate complications connected to these objects, to be more open for requests and demands coming from the outside to the museum for restitution. I don't think that it's possible to say, well, per se, these things have to go back. That's what.
Okay, I just want to add.
Did you want to say something?
You see, we have it on record that the Oba of Benin commissioned certain objects to be made and presented as gifts to the King of Portugal. They are the ivory salt cellars. So these types of objects, you cannot say they should be repatriated because legitimately regarded as gifts. And they were done in a particular way. But there are other objects that obviously were looted. And so these fall into clearly that kind of category.
Thank you. I just want to get Wayne's question because he had his hand up first and then got time for two more.
How to phrase this, and I want to phrase it to Nick. And it's two questions. And I start out by asking the audience, anybody who's tried to implement diversity policies in their museum, to try and implement a new policy to change the demographics of the museum. And once you say that, then somebody says to you, but diversity isn't only about this or that. It's also about gender, sexuality, age, whatever. So I start out with that to ask the question, two things. One, I am Jamaican and I like my Jamaican objects back. I want to tie that statement to Annie's question about claims, to ask if we can't generate a more complex understanding of claimant that does not always appeal to a selective group of people who say that it's okay, but rather think more complexly about what it might mean that I can stand and say, I'm indigenous to Jamaican and I want my objects back. Will I be quoted then in the future as somebody who has a right to say that? Or do we say Gail is more the person who can say it is okay? I want to understand a more complex, understanding of who is the claimant. Because sometimes I think we mobilize the claimant in support of our argument, perhaps easily. And we need to complicate that. And my second thing is, actually it goes back to, is the law a hindrance? Because I'm interested in understanding whether or not actually this flood of, and this goes back to my diversity question, this flood of efforts in provenance is a red herring. As a space of a site of obfuscation. of obfuscation to make, to set up a set of complexities, which does not necessarily push the discussion further. I'm wondering, because provenance has become the buzzword now. Everywhere we have a conference on it. And the question is, what does it do? And whether or not another horizon could be sketched, which is not necessarily based in such genealogies of proof and legitimacy, but some other form of thinking. Yeah, I don't want to put any words in your mouth, so thinking otherwise about it. I'm interested in why provenance becomes such an urgency in this moment, at the moment when the questions of the colonial seem to have arisen as such an urgent matter. I'm interested in those two things, and I even feel uncomfortable asking that.
So I just wanted to explain that we certainly recognise Rodney Kelly as an interested person who we have an obligation to engage in a respectful dialogue with, and he's been, welcomed to MAA a number of times, and he's been the ongoing discussion is informed by his interests and arguments. I think museums shouldn't be sort of formalistic in how they engage with things, and just because somebody isn't an accredited representative, that should not mean that you do not listen or do not engage or do not welcome them or do not give them direct access to material, which we did, and we would do that for anybody, whether they're a community visitor or a researcher. But I think there is a point where we have to, in terms of the formal process, we can only be responsive to the people who are recognised representatives, and we also have to acknowledge that, in a sense, the sort of political play that the Greens have involved in is hurtful to them as individuals. It's kind of just ignoring them very fundamentally. So I don't want to, dismiss Rodney's very sincere interests, but I'm also concerned that we do justice to their perspectives as well. And I think what you said about provenance is absolutely right. I mean, I feel that we do want to do deep research into the material culture and its histories and its stories, but there isn't any sort of kind of linear trajectory from the findings of that research to the questions of how things should be cared for, where they should be cared for, what policy frameworks are relevant to their management now.
Now, I know there were a number of other questions, but I'm just also a little bit concerned because it just means that if we go on, we won't have any tea and coffee. And I think people want a bit of a break.
$5 million US dollars for our ancestor, we can build a clinic
I don't think actually people have addressed that here. So it's a big, opening up a big issue, and I think it's a really important one. I don't think any of the papers were really talking about the substance, apart from perhaps an ideas of what would, what would happen.
I disagree, because even Mr. Macron was saying that we need to make sure that we're looking after our heritage, and it's our heritage, and all this wonderful stuff. So no, it's actually is implied. It is implied that there's an implication of we've got to make sure you look after it properly when we give it back to you.
Yes, it is conditional in that it has been and it is not.
Yeah, but, okay. Well,
Informal.
personally, in my opinion, I think a work that has become part of the global heritage, even though it belongs to the indigenous people, I think if it goes back to the indigenous people, it should be well looked after so that it's not taken out of the access of the global, heritage. I think it should be well looked after, because taking a work and selling it off, and then it goes into the black market where it's in private hands and nobody ever sees it anymore, then at the end of the day, what's the advantage? Because
You can do it, for example.
Yeah, so exactly. I
well,
understand.
Yeah, I guess. It depends on how you look at it, actually.
I think this is a big issue, and I think there may be chances to return to it, and I think that's what we should do. I think we should keep that in mind, because it's a very critical issue. One argument is, of course, that people should do what they want with it when they get it back. And Taonga, as I understand it, not being an expert in that area at all, it would exactly be fulfilling that to then be providing the clinic. And I've had that in other contexts, in fact, in Kenya, where the same thing has happened. So, yeah, I think it's a big issue. It's not one I think we can answer here, but I think it's something that we should bear in mind in terms of the other discussions that we have. And it would be nice to bring it back into the discussion later. So thank you, George. And thank you to our panel. Do we have time for a couple?